All right, everybody, welcome back to the Alert Desk here on this Thursday evening. Isaac Pekyash joining you. We just got done with our 5 o'clock hit for Erie News Now as we talked about redistricting Pennsylvania and how it could potentially affect Erie and the entire Commonwealth as a whole. So we had an expert on earlier today, and now we're bringing in another expert, someone that knows a lot more about this than me, and that's Joe Morris from Mercyhurst University. Joe, a lot of information to decipher after today and the information drop that we got. Actually, if you wouldn't mind putting that mic on while we're talking there, that way people can hear you. I'm sorry I forgot to ask you that earlier. But the census data drops and it can be overwhelming. There can be a lot of things people have to take into account: your county's population, your city's population, the state's population, demographic information. Were there any big takeaways that you had from the census data today that dropped that may have either been a surprise or that people should be on the lookout for?
Well, I think there's several surprises. I think there'll be even more once we get a full sense of what the census uncovered. But certainly for Erie County, it's not necessarily a surprise, but our population has continued to fall. In fact, the city of Erie is no longer number 4 in terms of the largest city in the state. We've slipped to number 5. And if we're looking at and talking about money, potential funds from the state or federal government, that could have a significant impact on the city.
Were you surprised to see that Erie County didn't move up or down in population? It was relatively stable. I think around 269,000 was the number for Erie County. But there had been a sharp decline in the last few decades with Erie County population. So some people might take this as a positive, even though there's no increase in population. What's your take on that?
Sure. What we saw across the United States, and we had a lot of hints leading up to the release today from the American Community Survey, but it seemed over the last decade that the vast majority of population growth was occurring in urban areas, that rural areas continued to lose population. And what we saw in Erie County was a little bit different. Our city center, our urban area, seemed to have lost a little bit of population. The surrounding areas stayed the same or perhaps grew just slightly, some of them.
Let me ask you about the state as a whole as we get into the redistricting aspect, and there's so many contingencies and layers to this, but when you lose a congressional district and you go from 18 to 17, I believe this is the 6th or 7th census in a row that Pennsylvania has lost a congressional seat. How does that affect the Commonwealth? Obviously you have to redraw the lines, but I assume it makes it even that much more difficult.
It does. I mean, that's just one less voice in the U.S. House of Representatives that we have. I think the real challenge for us is the fact that now we have a very difficult redistricting process. We have one member of Congress now that is no longer going to be here after redistricting occurs, an entire congressional district. And that poses, I think, real challenges for us politically. It means that we're going to have a much larger political battle.
Makes it interesting, and of course you'll have now a divide. One party will have more congressional members in D.C. than the other party, and there's been, of course, speculation as to who that member will be ousted from the congressional district in Pennsylvania. But let's dive a little bit more into redistricting, because I think there's been a lot of talk, even in the last couple of years before the census even came out, that Pennsylvania was going to have to do this. It's mandated every 10 years. And the question now becomes how you start the process. We know that there's gerrymandering. We know that there's a lot of political divide in how you divide these districts. But in your mind, where do you start? If you're a congressperson on this committee, how do you begin to even draw the lines?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's a really tough one to answer. Redistricting is something that the framers of the Constitution left for states to do. This isn't something that's done by the federal government. It's entirely up to us. And as a result, it's an inherently political process. Those who have the most power are going to get the district lines that they most want. Having said that, as a small d Democrat, in other words, somebody who really likes the idea of democracy, I think the place to start is through really what we seem to be observing here in Pennsylvania, and that is with input from the public. Over the last several years, there have been multiple efforts by several different groups to really change the way we do redistricting in the state. And one of these efforts, actually I was affiliated with one of these groups, had a map drawing competition, and where they allowed citizens from across the Commonwealth to redistrict the state themselves and do so in a way that was fair. And they held statewide competitions and an awards ceremony. It was an effort to really bring this to the public's attention and say, hey, your participation matters, not just now in this contest, but in the years ahead when we do redistricting. And I think that might be the place to start.
It's interesting that you said that, because the majority of our day today here at the newsroom has been trying to draw some of those maps. So let's go ahead and take a look at a couple of the maps here. And I want to start with the one that we have right now. This is the current layout of the districts just behind you. There's 18 of them. As we've been talking about throughout the day, Pennsylvania is going to lose one, so they'll go down to 17. Yeah. But as you look at this map, are there any immediate flaws that you see that you think need to be corrected pretty quickly as congressional leaders look to change this map?
Yeah, I think this is a fairly good map as far as congressional maps go.
Okay.
Many people will recall that just a couple years ago, the state Supreme Court stepped in and completely redrew our maps in the Commonwealth. And that's because Pennsylvania was, without a doubt, the most gerrymandered state in the entire United States.
In the whole nation? In
the entire nation.
Wow. Okay.
We held that unfortunate title for a number of years. So the place we're starting with is actually not a bad one. The way we drew congressional district lines back in 2018 when the court did it was to essentially give us a balanced congressional delegation. And if we look at the demographics of the state in terms of party membership, that's roughly what we are, a balance between Democrats and Republicans. So I think this is really not too bad of a place to start.
So the question then becomes, if the place that we're at right now isn't too bad, but you have to eliminate a district, you look at this map and it's funny, if we're just saying eliminating the 18th district, that's Allegheny County, that's part of it. So you're going to have to split up Allegheny County. Let's do an exercise, Joe, if you don't mind it. And what we're going to do is we're going to go to this blank map. We had another expert over here. We were trying to redraw the map ourselves. I don't know if we did a great job or not, but we'll try this here with you. If you wouldn't mind just kind of pointing to some of the places on the map that you think might be a good place to start when it comes to redistricting, because obviously it's not easy. Where do you start at if you're a politician trying to redraw this on the map here?
Well, there are certain rules you have to follow when you engage in redistricting.
Right.
The most important one is that every district has to have, as nearly as practicable, the same number of people in the district.
Which is why you see on this map at about 750,000 people, you have to keep it even.
That's the magic number.
Right.
And the other ones that you try to follow, Pennsylvania doesn't necessarily have legislation that says you have to, but the ones that you might try and follow are things like don't break up communities of interest. Where there are like-minded people, keep them together.
Right.
Don't cross political jurisdictional boundaries. Don't do what we did in 2010 and cut Erie County in half. Just not a good place to start. But I would suggest that what's likely to happen is that the place they will start is exactly with the map that we have.
Okay.
And that
in Erie County.
In Erie County.
Wow. Okay.
I expect that.
Okay.
And then which way you go from here, maybe to dip down a little further south. These are more populous counties. The closer we get to Allegheny County, the further we get east here, the more sparse the population. It's more difficult to find a few people. But to get to that 750,000 people that we need for this congressional district, we don't have to do a whole lot.
No.
Not a whole lot at all.
No, these 5 counties would do it on their own.
That's it. So that may in fact be what you see, just a minimal adjustment to the current congressional district.
So it wouldn't be anything significant for Erie County?
It may not be. But again, this is an inherently political process.
Right.
I expect that where we will see the greatest changes are in the congressional district in large urban areas, in the areas surrounding in Philadelphia and the surrounding areas, and in Allegheny County and the surrounding areas. Those are a little bit easier to tinker with because the movement necessary to add a large number of people or get rid of a large number of people is very little. It may be just a couple of blocks.
Let's show an example of what you mean by not splitting up like-minded communities. I'm going to scroll into Allegheny County here. Let's go into Pittsburgh, and I'm going to show all the block groups. This is kind of cool earlier. It actually shows the population of all of the little block groups within the counties. And I'm just going to quickly get rid of this here. So what you're saying for our viewers here, by not splitting up like-minded communities, you would not want something along this line where you put these counties, these blocks, for example, in one group, and then you were to split up and put these just below in another group.
That's exactly right. Now, communities of interest, I think are, even though they've been used as kind of a standard when they're redistricting, in Pennsylvania, again, they're not a formal requirement for congressional districts. There is some debate with regard to communities of interest. It's an ambiguous term. What does that mean? And should we even be making congressional districts that just have like-minded people? Might we not benefit from having a very diverse congressional district? Might not that eliminate some of that tension that exists between the parties? I happen to fall on, with the latter argument, that the more diverse the congressional district, the more opportunity there is for deliberation, and the more likely we are to produce moderate candidates who are willing to compromise, which is exactly what we need to do in a nation as diverse as ours.
Interesting you mentioned that, because that's one of the key things that could play a part in drawing the congressional district map. Another thing that plays a key part, though, as well, that at least we've been told here, is this category right here. It's the political lean category. And I want to show you, Joe, the map that we had done earlier with a couple of people at our station, a couple of experts. What we found is we started in Philadelphia, we moved up to the north, and one of the things we found is that even though our deviation was fairly on point, and our completion was fairly on point, and it made sense on the map, there was a lot of political deviation. So a map that might look like it makes sense doesn't necessarily if you heavily lean Democrat or heavily lean Republican. How challenging is it to keep that deviation to a minimum?
Well, I can tell you from having drawn several of these maps, just as an exercise with my students, that it's incredibly difficult. The fact is that we tend to find Democrats concentrated in a way that Republicans aren't necessarily. Democrats tend to find themselves, we tend to find lots of Democrats in urban areas.
Right.
Which means that it's very difficult to draw a diverse congressional district while keeping that district compact, contiguous, and trying to reflect like a community of interest of some sort.
Sure.
It's very difficult to do that. If you do, say, take Philadelphia, a neighborhood in Philadelphia or area in Philadelphia that is heavily Democratic, and you seek to create a more diverse part in terms of partisanship, a more diverse district, you end up with congressional districts that look like pieces of a pie. You get some of the Democrats down here, but it's so densely populated that that's a lot of Democrats, so you have to go way out here to get the Republicans you need. And we have to ask ourselves, are those really the congressional districts we want? This is why I say that this sort of activity is inherently political. It's where we as a people of a state have to come together and say, what is it, what values do we want reflected in our congressional districts?
And we see that on the map here that we had. The Philadelphia area was hugely lean Democrat. As we moved to the middle of the state, it was heavily lean Republican. So, Joe, I want to poke your brain a little bit, because you said you've made a lot of these maps. You and your students have made a lot of these maps. How much different, if you will, or similar, does the map look from the one that we have now? Because you said at the beginning of this that you thought that this map was pretty well aligned with where we needed to be.
It is. In terms, I mean, these are fairly, not all these districts are competitive. Some of them are entirely Republican, and there's no chance that a Democrat is ever going to win that district, and the same is true with our Democratic districts.
Sure.
But no map drawing exercise is going to result in a perfect map. But at the end of the day, what we have here is a congressional delegation that largely reflects the population of Pennsylvania in terms of partisanship. And we have a map that is relatively good in terms of having contiguous districts that are compact and don't cross political jurisdictions and the like.
Can you explain, and if it's just a population thing, that makes sense. A lot of the comments that we got earlier on our Facebook post was, why are districts like District 12 or District 15 gigantic, but compared to District 18, it looks like a huge difference. We know Allegheny County is more populated than these two other districts, but how do you to a common person like myself explain why it's okay for so many counties to be in one district even though they're smaller populations, whereas, you know, this one specific county gets its own district and therefore more representatives.
Yeah, look, these large congressional districts like 15 and 12 that stretch through the center of the state, as you mentioned, there's very few people that live in close proximity to one another. Its population is spread out. There's no other reason for it. I mean, it's just all about those numbers. If there's one rule that cannot be violated, it is that rule of equal population in districts. So you have to have districts that look that way. Having said that, look at the challenges we have here. You have people in the northern tiers of those districts that have very different interests and probably have no social or economic connections to people in the southern part of those districts. How can we say that that's a good district in terms of representing the values of a group of people? I don't know that we can. But this is going to be an imperfect result. We're not going to end up with perfect districts. There is no such thing.
How do you think redrawing the map could affect voting? On a national level, it probably won't, because Pennsylvania is going to vote how it's going to vote. It's been a relatively purple state for the last 20 to 24 years. On a local level, though, in voting for the state, could redrawing the map change how outcomes are determined or how numbers are skewed in terms of elections?
Yeah, what we're doing right now in this process of redistricting is we are determining who is going to win congressional elections for the next decade. And I can't stress that enough. It is incredibly important. The hope is that what we have is, at the end of the day, are competitive districts. Because what competitive districts do, and by that I mean a relatively equal number of Democrats and Republicans, a relatively diverse population, what we get with that is we get a competitive electoral process where it's not just one Republican competing against another Republican in the primary. It is a Democrat and Republican both standing a chance at winning, and they're having to battle for the middle ground. If you think about some of the challenges our nation faces, many of them have to do with ideological extremism. People who are way to the right or way to the left that are controlling the political party's agenda. A lot of that would likely go away if we had districts that were more competitive, because the people that are going to win those districts are people who are more moderate.
It's interesting you mentioned that, and again, it seems like things are starting to shift toward that moderate point of view, at least from the redistricting point of things. And it's always a good perspective when you have that. We know gerrymandering is a part of it. We hope it's not as much this year. I'll ask you, do you think it's going to play a significant part? We know it's going to play a part. How much will gerrymandering factor into the outcome of how this map is drawn?
Well, we're likely to see political wills expressed in the map that we're going to get. It's likely to be less than it was in 2010, but it will be there. The way we draw congressional districts in Pennsylvania is simply through the legislative process. The legislature passes a bill in both houses that is in identical form. It goes to the governor and he vetoes it or he signs it. It is as political as it gets. So the idea that somehow we're going to get a map that is free of gerrymandering for the state, it's not going to happen. And I should say further that the Supreme Court has said on a number of occasions that partisan gerrymandering is a problem that's created by the states, and it's a problem that the states have to handle. There's no constitutional remedy for it. So they have said, if you want better congressional districts in your state, you should elect better representatives to your state legislature and a better governor.
It's amazing how things kind of stack on top of each other. You use the domino effect, how voting can affect gerrymandering. And then another similarity, I should say, is how the census being filled out or not being filled out could also affect how the districts are redrawn. When you look at Erie County, for example, which didn't have much of a population growth or population decline, we don't know what the difference was between people who filled out the census and didn't fill out the census. In your mind, how much does filling out the census play a factor in redistricting and how that process works?
Yeah, it matters a great deal. If you don't fill out the census form, you're not counted. And if you're not counted, then you have to look for other people or other places to get the population you need. So The census has many flaws. It's not perfect. It doesn't count everybody, but we do know historically certain demographic groups haven't been counted at a higher rate than other demographic groups. So obviously people who are homeless are difficult to count. People who are in the United States illegally don't want to be counted often. They're difficult to count. People in large urban areas are often difficult to count. Those demographics are traditionally associated with the Democratic Party. So historically, we've seen, I think, a bias that has not worked in favor of the Democrats, which means that Democratic areas tend to be somewhat undercounted. And we know this because we remember in the last administration, there was a great debate over whether or not we should allow the Census Bureau to place a question about someone's immigration status.
Sure.
This was a partisan effort to change the way we count and therefore change the outcome so that Congress looks the way they want it to look.
So tell me if there's a good explanation for this, because a follow-up question that I think others would have to your answer would be, well, even if I'm not necessarily interested as much in voting, or I don't really have a care for it, if I vote, it counts. So shouldn't I be counted even though I'm not interested in the census because I'm here on this earth, I'm a human being? I mean, what's the explanation for that?
Yeah, well, if you want to be counted, you have to fill out the form. And the law says you have to fill out the form.
It's as simple as that.
It's as simple as that. Yeah, it's a very simple act, and it's one that is very important so that you are counted. And it's important not just for you, but it's important for your locality. Because in many cases, aid, funds, grants received from the state or from the federal government are determined by your area's population. And if that population is not counted, then that money's not coming.
Lastly, last thing I want to ask you about revolves around the amount of time it's going to take to get these districts redrawn. It seems to always be a long, drawn-out process. Do you foresee a similar experience here?
Yeah, I think we're likely to see lawsuits that follow. It's almost inevitable. There are several lawsuits were successful that challenged congressional districts across the United States after 2010. It took about a decade for many of those legal challenges to play themselves out. But I think a challenge to whatever map we get is inevitable. The question is whether or not those cases will have any ground to stand on.
Sure.
And I think the closer we get to a map that looks something like a map like this,
right,
a reasonable map, I think the better chance we have of establishing congressional districts and then seeing them go away, not until the next decade.
So lastly, I'll ask for your opinion. How likely is it we get that fair congressional map?
I'm a hopeful guy.
Okay.
I'm a hopeful guy. I think it's incredibly important for our democracy.
I would agree as well, and we will have 17 districts this time, and so as Pennsylvania continues to lose districts, they have to redraw the lines. And so we'll see if it's very similar. I do think it's interesting how you talked about how you think the map is indeed fair right now. And so I guess the last question then to you is, you don't expect a ton of change then potentially from this map?
Yeah, anything could happen.
Yeah.
As far as I'm concerned, we have a map that Pennsylvania should be fairly pleased with, that could probably get away with just a few modifications. But the fact that we're losing a congressional district means that we're probably going to have more than just a few tweaks. It'll be here and there. We're likely to see some big changes, but we have a good starting point here.
So then the last, I keep saying the last thing, but it brings up another question, and this is hypothetical, and other states are in this position. If Pennsylvania hadn't have lost a congressional district, but hadn't have gained one, they'd have stayed at 18, do you still have to redraw the map?
Yeah, you have to redraw the map every 10 years.
No matter what, even if you have the same number of
Yeah, if we wouldn't have lost a congressional seat, we probably wouldn't have had to make too many changes.
No.
We just did this 2 years ago. The court did it for us 2 years ago. But yeah, I mean, you redraw congressional districts every 10 years. You don't have to do it before 10 years. Even if we lost population down here, if everyone in Pittsburgh decided they wanted to move to Philadelphia, it doesn't mean you're required to redraw congressional districts. You have to wait a decade, but every decade you must redraw those lines.
And that is the fun of politics, is now we're at the time, you have a redrawing, you have an election cycle coming up, so you're going to be a busy guy in the next few years.
It's always an interesting time.
It is indeed. All right, that's Joe Morris from Mercyhurst University. Joe, thank you again for coming on. It's always good to get your expertise, and I'm interested to see how this map turns out. You can make all the predictions you want, but you never know.
You just never know.
You never know. All right, that's Joe Morris from Mercyhurst University. We've got more on Erie News Now at 6 as we continue our redistricting